Hi, everyone. My name is Dominic Midori Davis, and I'm a reporter at Business Insider, and welcome to South by Southwest Online. I'm here today with Brad Feld and Rodney Sampson, and we're going to be talking about building racial equity in startup communities. Gentlemen, welcome to South by Southwest. So let's dive in. The first question is for both of you. In the beginning of the pandemic, you put out this racial equity pledge. What has changed since then for the both of you, and where do you plan to go from here?
Whew. Wow. Well, first of all, I'm excited to be back at South by Southwest Online. Brad, how are you feeling today? Dom?
I'm good.
I'm good.
Excellent. All right.
Made it to the panel.
There you go. There you go. I asked that sort of distracting, question to you all because I could ground myself and process really that question, because I can tell you it's been a whirlwind, it's been a blur. And I want to say that, I wrote a post back, it must have been April, maybe, definitely after George Floyd, after Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor. And I wrote a Substack on, your ecosystem, your silence is complicit. And Brad sent me a simple note, basically said, hey, I got time, talent, and treasure. Let's talk. And that's how our relationship jumped off last year. And he and I had a few conversations, and, from there, I think we both agreed that the pledge was a starting point for this work. And I'll pause there for Brad to comment.
My mental model on so many things that I approach is I just approach them as startups. And when you're starting something, you can either decide that you know a lot or you don't. And from my perspective, in many cases, when I show up somewhere, it's I might have a view that I have some perspective, but I don't actually really know much about what's going on. And here specifically around racial equity, when George Floyd got murdered, I used a metaphor for myself that I had used in 2005 around gender equity. And specifically, I got involved in gender equity in 2005 because a woman named Lucy Sanders approached me about getting more girls and women involved in computer science. And that was, well before, again, 15 years ago, the imbalance on the gender equity front was very obvious. And I thought I had some sense of dynamics around gender equity because my parents are equals in their marriage, and my wife, Amy, and I are equals in our marriage, equal partners. But I found within 3 months of starting to work with Lucy as the founding chair of NCWIT that when men showed up, and it was usually white men at the gender equity discussion, at best they were neutral, what they said and did, and most of the time they were hurtful and harmful. And so I just shifted my whole mindset and said, you know what, I don't know anything, and I'm going to be involved and be engaged, and as part of that, not make assumptions that I know anything about what is actually both going on and what can be effective and helpful. When George Floyd got murdered, I used that saying, but I didn't take 3 months to figure it out. I realized that while I had, with Amy, through our philanthropic activities, been significant contributors to social justice activities going back 20 years, I was a passive participant in eliminating racism in America. And I looked at myself and I'm like, nope, that's not acceptable to me going forward. That's not okay. And but I don't have any idea what I should be doing to shift from passive to active. But what I do know is the same metaphor. In the case of NCWIT, the language became male advocate in gender equity. I can apply here, which is I can be an advocate or an ally or an accomplice, whichever language you like, and as part of that, I have these resources that Rodney talked about, which is time, network, and money. And I've been amazed. And the question was, what's changed in the last 6 months? 6 months ago or 8 months ago, I mean, I had a relatively small number of what I would consider to be close Black friends. And I wouldn't have counted Rodney in that. I mean, we'd interacted maybe by email a few times, but not a lot. And in that, I just showed up with a number of them and said, how can I get involved in things you're doing to support you? What's happened in, again, 6, 7, 8 months is the number of people that I'm now working with and supporting and helping, and the things I'm learning about what I can do to be an active participant or an accomplice in eliminating racism in America and improving the racial equity dynamics in tech are very substantive, and they're driven through that experience rather than some preconceived notion I had. And what I'm seeing as different is many, many, many more people who, could be, again, allies, accomplice, whatever language we want to use, are showing up that way. And versus either being passive or showing up like, well, this is what we should do, or this isn't a problem, or, here, let me do this to try to solve a problem that it's not actually my own lived experience. So I'll just end with Rodney has been a tremendous friend for me in this experience because he didn't have to invest his time in a person like me. But one of the powerful things is the feedback loop. It's not just me extending resources to Rodney. It's Rodney including and engaging me in everything he's doing, and that then becoming with the same philosophy we use in startup communities, right? Take a 20-year view. That same philosophy plays out for a very long period of time. So, Rodney, I don't know if that's consistent with how you feel about the last 6, 7, 8 months, but
just even reflecting back there, Dom, is when you think about building these startup communities, and you think about it globally, then you think about it in America, and then you drill down to hyperlocal cities. I sort of look at my work in 2 decades at a time, and I think about going back 20 plus years ago, being a founder of Edge Tech streaming company back then that was eventually acquired, not knowing that 20 years later you wouldn't be able to actually literally engage without streaming. There was a use case for Calamity, but we didn't know it would be the pandemic. And then kind of halfway through, kind of a little burnout, on company building, and also being burnt out of being like the only Black person and many times Black man in these rooms. I got tired of being the outlier. And what attracted me was, reading some of the earlier work of Brad around building startup communities, sort of with what I call the Damon John philosophy, FUBU, for us, by us. And I often joke with Damon, he's a dear friend, about how OHUB had been building, or we started building this for us, by us startup community initially in Atlanta, and then other folks would come to Atlanta. Next thing you know, Miami's jumping off, and Nashville and Memphis, and folks were coming and watching our, kind of our work. And then what we realized that there was really a science to building these ecosystems, but the next 10 years of that work, until last year, it was still sort of us few outliers engaging. And so since Brad and I really joined forces on a few things, I'm starting to see some structural reimagining of what startup communities could look like if diversity, equity, and inclusion was built into the framework or the actual playbook. And so, but that takes time, right? Because these are fast-moving entities, fast-moving constructs. And to get it to like slow down and to reimagine itself is hard, because that fast moving is tied to people's existing livelihoods. We got capital to get out of the door. we've got programs to run, we've got founders to accelerate, and founders have companies to run. So if you can imagine, it took last year to get people to like slow down enough to look. And then we've sort of been like in this incubation period of what I believe is this next age of equity in startup communities. And I think this year, and I'm talking more about, I think last year was a year of what can we do fast to make sure that we don't find ourselves on the other side of history. So you saw a lot of commitments, a lot of hashtags, a lot of, nicely written letters. But then you saw a lot of Black fund managers raise a lot of capital, and you saw Black founders closing their seed rounds, in these unheard of timeframes. But I think the next phase is the structural phase, where we actually have to rebuild these ecosystems. And it's probably going to take a little bit longer to see the output of that, so that eventually we normalize Black founders closing seed rounds and, closing fund managers closing rounds and companies being acquired. It just becomes a thing. You're like, oh yeah, it's another company. Yeah, okay, great. It's not news anymore, or it's not headline news. So to me, that's a reflection of what I really see starting to take form and shape going into 2021. And I do think that the pandemic plus the race reckoning created a special moment in history that without either of them, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now.
Yeah, and so, since you both are kind of coming into this issue like in different times and parts in your lives, what are some of the biggest issues you've seen marginalized startup communities face? And which of those problems do you think that the race reckoning and like the Black Lives Matter fallout will actually fix?
I have kind of a horizontal view of that question, which is the startup communities, if you use a geographic lens, one of the challenges that exists using sort of racial equity as a perspective is that many situations where you have a geographic startup community, it does not configure itself in a way, or it's not configured in a way to be inclusive of all the participants who want to engage. And this was a thesis of mine or a principle of mine from the very first book that I came out with in 2012, which is the third principle, the Boulder thesis, is you have to be inclusive of anyone who wants to engage in the startup community. However, there's a very powerful element of that, which I'll just use it as the one example of this, where just because you say you want to be inclusive doesn't translate to inclusivity. And it's not even performative, dynamics, it's just behavioral. So an example of this, and I'll use it from where I live in Boulder, Colorado, in the town adjacent to Boulder is Longmont. Longmont is, Boulder is probably 95% white. Longmont is probably 60, 70% white, and it's probably 25% Hispanic. So the characteristics of the community are different. They're relatively close to each other. I live on the edge of Longmont, so 30 minutes to downtown Boulder. So if you talk to a Hispanic entrepreneur in Longmont and say, look, come be part of the Boulder startup community, it turns out that while there's inclusivity, that person, let's say it's a 42-year-old single mother of two who is starting her business and also running, working for somebody to make money to take care of her kids. She can't get in the car and drive 30 minutes to Boulder. And then even when everybody says, oh, it's awesome you're here, she looks around, she's like, none of these people look like me. They're not dealing with the same issues I'm dealing with. I don't belong to this. And then she doesn't have the couple hours to spend. And then when everybody goes out afterwards to whatever the after party is, she's got to go back home 30 minutes. It's backwards. Really what should be going on, if you want to be inclusive, is that those bolder entrepreneurs should go to things in Longmont, should go participate with her and her peers and the network that's developing, and help amplify and link those networks together. And I just use that as an example. We don't have time, I could give 10 or 15 examples like that, but it's this notion of not being bashful. Bashful is the wrong word. Not being feeling good about the idea of, we're inclusive, but then recognizing that the inclusive community that you're creating is actually not inclusive because you're asking people to come to you rather than you go to them. Last comment to Rodney's point, all of these things take a while. So because entrepreneurship, and especially tech entrepreneurship, has generated, very significant wealth in a time of extraordinary inequity, one of the powerful things that people in startup communities who have generated wealth can do is focus some of their energy on, in the cities, in the regions, in the places they live, turning, like you said, horizontal, turning sideways their frame of reference in terms of where they're investing time and energy in the next wave of entrepreneurship. By going to communities that are more diverse, or that are, whatever language one wants to use in terms of, I think you said marginalized or disadvantaged. I don't think it has to be specific language. It's literally trying to extend the aperture so that many more people have access to startup community and entrepreneurial activity through the benefits and the rewards that many people have reaped, but not by saying, come to me, but by doing backwards in this. Not by saying, hey, Rodney, come to me. It's by saying, hey, I'll go to you. And then I'm engaging there. That's the, sorry for the long story, but that's the point.
No, I mean, it's interesting. If I could just jump in for a minute to say, so as we look at remote work and working from home continue, would you both agree that, having this continue could possibly increase racial equity in some startups or just like companies in general?
For me, I'm going to answer first because Rodney has a longer answer. My quick answer is yes, absolutely. Like the amount of time that I've spent working, not just with Rodney, but with a number of other friends around the issue, and when I say friends, I mean Black and brown friends, around the dynamics of racial equity in the last 6 months, has been 10 times the amount of time I would have spent if I was geographically focused, and the idea of going to places and being in places. And so I think it is a very powerful accelerant. It's not a solution, but it lowers the friction of the engagement quite substantially. Rodney, you have a longer answer, I think.
I mean, last year in hindsight, and even going into this year, is quite interesting because, when I came along raising capital, and until last year was always, you have a good call with an investor, and they're like, well, hey, let me know the next time you'll be in the area. And most, intuitive fundraisers, whether it's a fund manager or a founder, would say, well, oh, by the way, I'll happen to be there next week. Like you knew what you had to do to actually get a meeting, because other than that, it may not be a call for you to come to the area. And so that can be restricted, getting on a flight, if you're an early stage founder and you're, we won't regurgitate the income gaps and the wealth gaps, but you've got to have an ability to actually get to the money and get to the programs. What if you live in a market where there's not, an active pre-accelerator or an accelerator or a tech hub or funds, and you got to get there. So when you layer geography on top of race, you double down some there. But last year we saw folks raising seed rounds from the comforts of their home, hopefully sheltering safely in place. We saw people, customer acquisition was more efficient. You didn't have to get in front of people. We saw people completing virtual accelerators and demo days, even at accelerators like Techstars. I mean, at OHUB, we had last year over, 50 Black and brown folks that actually went through a rapid reskilling immersive boot camp. And, I think of one of our students who actually just finished a Techstars accelerator, but last year he was living in Beaumont, Texas, and he moved to Dallas to go through one of our boot camps with a friend. The boot camp instructors were in Raleigh, Durham. It was through a program in Atlanta at Morehouse. He graduated, got an internship in Raleigh, Durham, then got a full-time gig in DC, making like $90K, and then ended up becoming a co-founder of a Techstars-backed company, and he's never left Dallas the whole time. So when you talk about the depth of distance, so folks are like, it's gonna open back up. I'm like, please don't open back up the way it did. We cannot go back to that. We have to leverage that, because if we go strictly back to the old rules of like, hey, when can you get to Boulder? When can you get to Atlanta? When can you get to Austin? We're going to turn back time. And so we're going to have to figure out how to keep this engine moving forward. And I do think hyperlocal innovation ecosystems and equity districts, which is, by the way, the name of our new podcast. But we're going to see these hyperlocal, but yet global connected ecosystems come online.
Yeah. And so what are your thoughts on nobody likes to use the word force, but kind of forcing companies in a sense to implement measures like this? I mean, what are your thoughts on setting benchmarks and criteria for companies that are looking, that were saying, maybe a board member or this many people has to be female or by POC? What are your thoughts on kind of nudging companies along to kind of do it even once the pandemic subsides?
I've taken a very specific approach personally, which is I'm on a bunch of boards, and I went to all the boards I'm on and said, it's very simple. I'm just not interested in being on boards with a bunch of white men sitting around a table anymore. And some of my boards were not. Some of the company boards were not that. I said, I'm just not interested. And so I want every one of our boards to evolve, whether we add people to the board or we replace people and change people out. And I want to get both women and people of color on the boards, period. And that has to be part of the mission of what we're doing. And I think that is a behavioral norm that more and more long-term investors are embracing. There's lots of organizations that are now helping with that. And there's examples, and I'll just leave with one example. My partners and I at Foundry started a new company that went public last year. It's in this category called a SPAC. I think some people here probably are familiar with them. We took a company called Crucible Acquisition Corp public, and we made a very deliberate decision when we made the board of that public company, that public company board, other than the CEO, who's a white male, and me, who's chair, who's a white male, our board was entirely not white men. So we have 3 outside board members. All 3 are women. One is Black. And, if you look at the women that are on the board, Jewel Burke is one of them. Meg Porfido is another, and Sarah Bach is the other. Kind of the view is, let's build a very highly functional board, but that has it built into it, this notion of it not being a negative bias against diversity on a go-forward basis. I think that behavior from the bottom up has to happen, and there have to be more people, whether they're organizations like Him for Her, organizations like NCWIT, that are very focused not just on one element of diversity like gender, but are also very focused on the intersectionality between gender, race, sexual orientation, et cetera, sexual identity, in the context of this change. And I'm hopeful that, if there's enough bottom-up activity, it will be complemented by some top-down activity, but it will be built into the wiring of what we are doing.
And I think that's kind of all we had time for today. So thank you two so much for the insightful conversation, and thanks for all that watched online. I hope to see you all next year in person. But until then, stay safe and healthy, everyone.
Tom, thank you.
Thank you.